And now, marine weather around Alaska.
All right, looking at tonight's weather again. A lot of moisture here over the southeast coast. Snow continues here over the northern panhandle. Winter storm warnings for Juneau area over toward Hoonah, on up in toward the Klondike Highway, Skagway, Haines area for continued several more inches of snow. Stays wet here over the southern panhandle. High pressure, clear skies, and a cold night again up here in the central and eastern interior. And wind starting to come down here for the North Gulf Coast area, Madawaska Valley, and Kenai Peninsula. And then a weak system bringing some light snow in to the west and northwest interior. Blizzard warning ends at 10 p.m. for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast as winds come down and snow lightens up there. And a weak front out here over the Bering Sea. We'll see moves inland and kind of links up with that trough that was there today, and the moisture all kind of merges together, pushes a chance of snow in toward Indian Mountain and right on up the Yukon River there, extending back to the northwest, across the western Arctic coast, Noatak Valley area, down into the Seward Peninsula, kind of a light mix of precipitation here over the southwest coast, and some clouds and light showers occurring along the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula. Break behind that system. Big storm out here to the west on Sunday. Continues northeastward there across Russia, heading toward the coastal areas there. But that pushes a very strong frontal boundary here into the Bering Strait and good southwest winds. Got coastal flood watches out for the Kuskokwim Delta coast right on up to the western Arctic coast. And winter weather watches out, winter storm watches out here. Blowing snow pushing into the western interior. Strongest here, the Bering Strait, Seward Peninsula, up along the northwest coast. And that looks good for gusts of 70 miles an hour, better for places like Point Hope and Cape Lisburne. So pretty strong winds, snow and blowing snow with this feature. Different story on the east side. Sunny day, light winds. South central Alaska, Copper River Basin, all the North Gulf Coast. And hopefully mostly clear over the panhandle. Still some gusty north winds there over the Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay areas. And for the coastal water forecast, we get the right side of the picture here. West to southwest winds tomorrow at 15 to 20 knots on the south coast. Central coast, east to northeast winds at 20 knots, seas 7 to 8 feet. And northeast winds 15 to 20 knots on the north coast. Lynn Canal, north winds 25 knots with gusts of 40 knots. Otherwise, north 15 for Stevens Passage, seas 3 feet, southeast 15 for Clarence Strait. And for the day on Sunday, east-northeast winds, 20 to 25 knots on the south coast there. Central coastal areas, east-northeast at 25 knots. And the north coast, north to northeast winds at 10 to 20. Lynn Canal, north wind 30 knots. Stevens Passage, north at 25 knots, and Clarence Strait, north winds at 20 knots. Prince William Sound tomorrow, also looking at north winds at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Then we've got small craft advisories and gale warnings out for the eastern North Gulf Coast. North to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Those gusts out of the Copper River Delta less tomorrow than they were today. Western North Gulf Coast, north winds 30 knots. Cook Inlet, north at 15. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, northwest winds at 35 knots, and small craft advisories for the for this area here for northwest winds at 30 knots. And then for the area here coming out of across Augustine Island there, 30 knots out of the west, northwest 30 knots for the Barren Islands. And for Cook Inlet, light variable winds at 10 knots with seas coming down to 1 foot. So really laying down here for Cook Inlet. Not too bad for Prince William Sound as well. Northwest at 15 knots with 2-foot seas. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, north to northeasterlies at 15 to 25 knots. Northwest at 20 for the western North Gulf Coast. And for Bristol Bay, northwest winds at 20 knots tomorrow. And west-northwest winds for the Alaska Peninsula, also at 20 knots. Seas running 3 to 5 feet. Kodiak Island, small craft advisories. Northwesterlies at 25 to 30 knots with seas up to 6 feet. And then for Sunday, lighter winds there around Kodiak Island, southwest for Chillicothe Strait at 20 knots, west 20 knots on the east side of the island, and from Bristol Bay, west winds at 20 knots, and the Alaska Peninsula here, south to west winds at 15 to 20 knots, with seas running 2 to 5 feet. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, southwest to west and northwest winds, 15 to 20 knots, light variable winds at 20 knots or less here for Adak and Atka, with seas at only 2 to 4 feet. Then winds increase here west of Adak, looking at small craft advisories for Amchitka Island for south winds at 25. Good gales, Kiska Island to Shimia, southwest winds 40 knots, seas 11 feet. And then for Sunday, 40-knot winds continue out here for the western Aleutians, advance eastward toward Adak out of the south and southwest. Southwest gales for the central Aleutians at 35 knots, and the eastern Aleutians small craft advisory south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Southwest coast for tomorrow, west-southwest winds 15 knots, west at 20 knots for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, looking at southwest winds also at about 20 knots. And then for the day on Sunday, big increase in the winds here for the Pribilof Islands, St. Matthew Island, southwest 35 knots for St. Paul and St. George. St. Matthew Island southwest at 40 knots with 22-foot seas. Gale warnings here for the southwest coast, 35-knot winds. Gale warnings also for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound for south winds at 35 knots. Eastern Bulbert Sea coast, winds coming down, as you can see, west 15 to 25 knots, southeast at 10 for the central coast, southeast 15 for the western Arctic coast and the Chukchi Sea, southwest to southeast winds at 20 to 25 knots. And those increased dramatically for Sunday here, south to southeast winds 40 knots with 8 to 9 foot seas for the Chukchi Sea, western Arctic coast south at 20 knots, seas 5 feet, south at 15 on the central coast, and lighter winds now for the eastern Bulbert Sea coast at about 10 to 15 knots.